welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. Today on the show, I want to talk about a capability that can be incredibly valuable for human flourishing. And this is what I call constructive conversation. How do we have constructive conversations about issues that are both crucial and controversial? Because you might think, we can have a constructive conversation if it's something we both agree on, but there's just a crucial value in being able to have constructive conversations about issues that are controversial, but themselves very important. So that's the topic today. Before we get into that, I want to summarize where we are in the show so that those of you who are new will know where I'm coming from, and those of you who have listened before will get a review. So the Human Flourishing Project exists to solve the problem that, to me, is most frustrating but also most fascinating, which is that human beings lack reliable access to the knowledge we need to flourish. That's the problem that I keep repeating over and over, and the reason I do is because it's really frustrating. I want to flourish, which means live to my highest potential, and I want other human beings to be able to, and that requires a lot of knowledge. And what I find over and over and over, whether it's nutrition or psychology or different issues in policy, it's incredibly hard to get real knowledge that I can count on, that I can rely on, even if I work pretty hard at it. So the Human Flourishing Project is all about tackling that, and the basic approach to that, which I talked about in episode 2, is a knowledge systems approach. So the traditional approach to this problem of not having real knowledge is just to seek out new claims to knowledge, to hope that the latest TED Talk or podcast is somehow going to have the answer. And my approach is that's not going to work, because what we really need are better underlying systems for approaching knowledge. And one category of system is we need better knowledge acquisition systems. So as consumers of knowledge, we need to be able to be more discerning. We need different processes to help us to, say, seek out new knowledge, to validate it, to integrate it, so that we understand how everything fits together. And I've talked a little bit about those processes. We also need to be in a world where there are better explanation systems, where people who have knowledge, superior experts, and that can be a subject matter expert, that can be a business with a better idea, that can even be you knowing something for sure, and you're in a conversation with someone who doesn't, and they don't expect to agree with you. So broadly speaking, we need superior experts to be much better at explaining their views in a way that is more persuasive than those who are wrong. And that's what we talked about in last episode. When I say we, hopefully you're talking in your head as you're listening. So far I haven't had any guests using I guess they call it the royal we. But in any case, what I talked about was how we want superior experts to have these better explanation systems. And I talked about a couple of concepts that I found very valuable in explaining knowledge that I have. And the two big concepts were context bridging, and that's a model of explanation where I think of it in terms of the other person has a context, which is the sum of things they know and think they know, and then I have a context, which I think of theirs as context A and mine as context B, and that's the sum of things that I strongly think I know, and I need to figure out how to bridge that. And that really consists of three types of things. One is adding new knowledge to their context. Another is subtracting wrong context. And then the third, and maybe the most important, is modifying half-true context. Often there will be partially true ideas that somebody has that we need to modify or clarify to get to the truth. So that's what we've focused on so far. Knowledge acquisition systems, knowledge explanation systems, and then I've mentioned a little bit knowledge application systems. Once we have the knowledge, how do we use it? And that's something I want to cover in a future show, and I had planned to cover it today, but this week I was thinking a lot about explanation and acquisition in the context of constructive conversation, because in conversation, if we do it the right way, we are both explaining things that we know that somebody else doesn't know, but we're also learning things that we don't know that somebody else knows. And for the past couple of years, I've taught a workshop in my work in energy, helping people that I believe are right about energy, help them have more constructive conversations about energy, mostly so they can be more persuasive to people who don't know as much. And recently, I've started teaching the same workshop and the same concepts to more general audiences, because constructive conversation is something that we all need. And I think most people would acknowledge this. The idea of having a constructive conversation is amazingly appealing to a lot of us. It's just highly elusive. It's difficult. And to define my terms, I think of the goal of a constructive conversation as to combine the knowledge and thinking abilities of two people to build a better understanding. So again, to combine the knowledge and thinking abilities of two people to build a better understanding. Constructive is deliberately talking about construction, building. We want to end the conversation better than we began it. And this can be difficult, particularly where we need it most, which is where there are controversial issues. There's some issue that's really a matter of life and death, or at least joy and suffering, and people have really strong opinions on it, and they can't all be right, at least not if they're really having the opinion about the exact same issue. And it's really valuable for us to get at the right answer, and if we care about somebody, for us, if we're right, to be able to explain our answer. But because of many reasons, including just the habits that we have about conversation, usually, or at least often, when people come into conversations exposed to different views, it does not go well. So the world right now is full of destructive conversations, or at least non-constructive conversations. And I often use the term frustrating fight to describe what happens. So you can think about in all kinds of areas in your life, whether it's personal relationships or business relationships or policy/political issues that you think are really important, coworker relationships. There are all sorts of occasions where constructive conversation is something that's very appealing, but again, it's often highly elusive. And so today I want to talk about how I've come to think of constructive conversations and introduce you to the system that I've developed for it, because I've found it pretty simple and incredibly powerful. And the key concept, this is particularly relevant for those of you who listened last week, to having constructive conversations, in my experience, is the concept of framing, which I talked about a little bit last week, and today I'm going to elaborate on it in the context of conversation. So, but whether or not you heard last week, let me explain it fresh in the context of conversation. And I'll do it this way. I'll just summarize for you an idea that's one of the most powerful ideas that I've ever happened upon. And this is one, it's the kind of idea I love. The kind of idea I love most is an idea that is very powerful and pretty easy to execute. So very powerful and pretty easy to execute. And this, you can't always find one of these in life, but sometimes you can. And in episode 3, I talked about one of these, which is a term I got from the business strategist/guru Dan Sullivan, and it's this concept, or he has a tool called the positive focus. And if you go back to that episode, that's a tool for very quickly and dramatically improving the way that you evaluate progress to allow you to enjoy progress a lot more. And it's almost stupid simple, but it's really effective. So I love ideas like that. And then the one I'm about to talk about is in this category. And so here it is. The framework of a conversation is both fundamental to its success and extremely easy to improve. The framework of a conversation is both fundamental to its success and extremely easy to improve. So I'll expand on that. Framework, let's start there. Framework is a term that we can use in both physical building, but also in explanation building. So a framework is the starting structure of something. In physical building, it's the starting structure of, say, a building or a car. And what's notable is that we acknowledge that in those kind of contexts, the starting structure influences everything else. So the framework of a building is going to influence everything else about a building. And the framework of a car is going to influence everything about the car. And just as there are frameworks in physical building, so there are frameworks in mental building. So in our own minds, there are starting structures that we begin our thought processes with that determine everything else. So one might be how we approach, say, logic and emotion. That's a big kind of starting structure, and different people have different approaches, and that's going to affect a lot of other things. And certainly in a conversation, the starting structure of the conversation is going to influence everything else. So one example I give that I'll elaborate on more a little later today, but just to give you an indication, is people have starting ideas in a conversation, whether they know it or not, about bias versus even-handedness. And in most conversations about controversial issues, people have a tendency to be biased for their pre-existing conclusion and against their things that they think are not right. So I gave the example last week of, since a lot of my work is in energy, I think of energy examples in the field of nuclear power. When people tend to, so nuclear power is one form of what we can call non-carbon energy. It's a form of energy that doesn't involve carbon materials, and thus it doesn't generate CO2, which that's a whole issue in today's energy discussion. But what's interesting is when people consider non-carbon forms of energy, when they think about nuclear energy, they tend to look for negative things about it, and they tend to, in my experience, exaggerate negative things about it, and say when they look for solar energy or wind energy, they tend to look for positive things about it and exaggerate positive things about it. If you want more of this particular example, I have a talk called Energy and Human Flourishing that's on YouTube that talks about this kind of bias. But hopefully you'll recognize this bias with that issue, but surely you'll see that with different issues, people bring in biases. And if you have a framework that it's okay to be biased in favor of your pre-existing preference, then the conversation is going to go badly. And if people have two different pre-existing preferences, then the conversation will go really badly. And what I found is that it's actually not that hard to frame the conversation well with the issue of bias. That actually a huge amount can be accomplished by just saying, hey, would you agree that when we look at our different options, we should be as even-handed as possible? So we need to look at both the pros and cons of nuclear as carefully as we can, and we also need to look at both the pros and cons of solar as carefully as we can. We can't just look at the pros of one and the cons of another. And what I found when I started doing that is that it was amazingly effective because, and this goes to my summary, the framework of a conversation is both fundamental to its success and extremely easy to improve. If I could get the conversation to be more even-handed, just like changing the structure of the car would change everything about the car, and if I could improve the structure to improve everything. So if I could get the conversation to be more even-handed, that would improve every other thing about that conversation. So that's amazing, but it's actually pretty easy to do. And the reason is because good framing is often something that's common sense but not common practice. And we find this a lot in the world. Some things are common sense. They make sense once we identify them, but they're not common practice, often because we don't talk about them enough. And this is an example of that, where we don't talk at all really about the framing of conversation. We just jump into our facts and our claims to fact and our evaluations. But if we can focus on the framing, then we can notice that, hey, there's a lot of things we can agree on about the framing. And then once we agree on them at the level of framing, then the conversation can get a lot better. Again, the framework of a conversation is both fundamental to its success and extremely easy to improve. So I'm going to give you some examples of ways to frame a conversation. But before I go into these examples, I just want to say that this kind of idea is an idea that even just on your own, without me going into examples, it's worth just thinking about how can I leverage this idea that the framework of a conversation is both fundamental to its success and extremely easy to improve. Because at the end, certainly, I'm going to encourage you to think of your own ways to frame a conversation to make it better. And that'll be really interesting to see what people share. But I want to talk about three key ways to frame a conversation. I think of these as three key premises to frame a conversation. So a premise is that a certain kind of logical point that then certain things follow from. So you can think of a premise, a framing premise, as one of those starting structures of a conversation. And I'm going to name three of them. These are not the only three, but these are three that I have found incredibly useful. And actually the second one, which I'm going to talk about, even those who have heard me talk about framing, you've probably never heard me talk about this one, but it's a particularly important one. So the three are common goal, clear choices, and full context. Common goal, clear choices, and full context. So let's just jump in. Common goal. One of the framing premises we want is we want to be clear with the other person if we're talking about any kind of choice, which is a lot of what conversations are, talking about choices or decisions. We want to be clear on, okay, what's the goal? What's the ultimate goal of this choice, this decision? Because if we're not aligned on the ultimate goal, then how are we going to agree on the right decision? Because the ultimate goal is going to determine the standard by which we make the right decision. So you can imagine, to take an extreme example, but a real example, there are certain people who believe, and in the realm of medicine, that really the goal of medicine is to be as natural as possible. So not just that certain quote-unquote natural medicine is good sometimes, but that we should always be natural. And that we should, on principle, refuse to intervene medically or with certain types of technologies. And you have certain religious sects that believe this, and you have cases of kids dying because they don't get access to a modern medical treatment. And in that kind of discussion, and in any discussion, it's just important to say, okay, what is the goal? So if a doctor is talking to a patient, it's just important that everybody know what is the goal. And even if the people agree on the goal, which they often will, it's very valuable to mention that at the outset of the conversation so that we can then think of the choices clearly as, okay, which one is really going to serve that goal? Because often what will happen is there will be certain considerations that come up, including, hey, do we want a natural remedy or something like that? And sometimes people will mistakenly treat that as the goal, even if they don't want it. So for example, to take a controversial example, but just hear me out if you haven't heard me talk about this, in the realm of energy, sometimes people treat the goal in energy as we want no impact on climate. Like our goal is to have no impact on climate in energy. Like that's what we want, the form of energy that least impacts climate. Now you can say that that's a consideration, but it's not really tenable to say, well, the only thing the number one consideration in energy is whether something affects climate or not. And in part because there are good ways to affect climate, hypothetically, like if we could stop a really bad storm. So having the idea of no climate change, that's not the right way of thinking about it, even though that might be a consideration in choosing the best form of energy. So ultimately, if we're thinking about the best form of energy, we want to think about the safety of it, which is related to the climate issue, but we also want to think about things like abundant, affordable, reliable. So we might think, okay, the goal in energy is we want something that's the best combination of abundant, affordable, reliable, and safe, but it's not just one thing like safe, and it's not even just one thing like no impact on climate, which is much less coherent than safe. So the more that we're clear on, okay, this is the ultimate goal, and this is just one piece of that puzzle, then the conversation is going to be infinitely better, and we can stop ourselves from talking across each other, and it's just incredibly, incredibly valuable. And yet it doesn't happen very often because we're not taught to frame conversations. But we should now think, okay, if we can get clear on a common goal early in the conversation, that's going to make everything else better. So let's make that one of our goals in conversation to do that. And then, okay, how do you do that? Well, and this is where I'm going to ask at the end for you to think of your own creative ways of doing it, because there are different ways of doing it, but I'll just share with you for each of these ideas mine. And it's just here, it's really simple the way that I'll do it. I'll just think about the goal. And for me, the goal is always going to be some aspect of human flourishing. So let's say if I was a doctor talking to a parent about the health of the child, I'd say, okay, would you agree that our goal is the choice that's best for your child's long-term health, right? Because that would be the aspect of human flourishing that would be most relevant. Or in energy, I would think of it as the choice that's the best combination of abundant, affordable, reliable, and safe. So you can think of this for any issue. There's going to be some goal that really captures what aspect of human flourishing you're talking about. Or sometimes when I'm thinking about, say, how to spend my weekend, I might think of, okay, the aspect of human flourishing or aspects I'm interested in are I want something that's going to be rejuvenating and also help me connect to other people because my work is fairly solitary. So I think, okay, if I'm having a conversation about how to spend the weekend with somebody, I might think, okay, this is my goal. Would you agree that this is a good goal? Because if they don't agree it's a good goal, then we're not going to have a good conversation. So they at least need to understand that that's my goal. If I'm having a constructive conversation about them, like here's what I want to do together, here's what I don't want to do together. So in any case, if we can get clear on a common goal, then it's incredibly beneficial, and it's pretty simple. Just ask. Suggest what the common goal is. See if they agree. If they don't agree, then talk it through. And if you can't get agreement, then you at least understand, okay, we're not going to get an agreement on the choice if we don't have an agreement on the goal. So that's common goal. That's number one. Number two is clear choices. And this is one I haven't talked about much, particularly in any of my public material. It sometimes comes up in workshops. And the more I think about it and the more I apply constructive conversation to different fields, the more I see, oh, wow, this is huge. Conversations often go off track because when people are talking about the right choice, they don't start out by getting clear on the choices. And there are a couple of ways in which this happens. So let's say so one thing people can do is they can leave out choices. So for example, let's say that to take the nuclear power example, people are talking about what's the best policy on nuclear power. And often when people talk about technologies, they often talk about them in binary pro or con ways. So, let's have a policy that's pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. And in effect, the choices people are saying are, let's have a policy where there's no laws about nuclear or where nuclear is banned. And if that's a false choice, because you can have policies that say, okay, no, nuclear is allowed, but there are these laws against specific dangerous practices. And if people are going to have a constructive conversation about nuclear options, they should have a conversation about real options. This happens all the time particularly in my experience where there are issues of political freedom involved. I mean, definitely one of my convictions is that political freedom is a fundamental of human flourishing, and I'm sure I'll talk about that on some future episode if understood properly. And often when people talk about policies, they often leave out what I would regard as the freedom option. For example, when people talk about how the healthcare system works, they usually talk about different ways in which the government can dictate healthcare, and they'll assume that the current system basically doesn't have the government doing anything, and they'll say, hey, maybe the government should come in and fix this. But there's not really a possibility on the table of, hey, what would happen if the government weren't involved in healthcare, if healthcare were all about the voluntary choices of patients and doctors. So whether or not that's the right position, and I think it ultimately is, it's important that we're not having constructive conversations about healthcare or many other issues because certain policies are off the table. So that's a bad thing, to leave out the choice. Another related one is misrepresenting the choices. This happens all the time, that people will misrepresent a certain option. So, for example, with the leaving out certain, what I would call a truly free market or voluntary healthcare system, people will leave that out, but sometimes they'll misrepresent it and say, oh, well, we already have that today, and look at how expensive healthcare is. And even if you want to say that a free market solution is bad, it's not honest to say that today's system is a free market system, and thus to say, oh, well, today's prices are free market prices, because that's not the system that exists. So what's happening is a certain choice has been misrepresented. And that's something we need to be really, really wary of, that when we talk about our different options, we don't misrepresent the ones that we have a predisposition against. And another issue or example of people not being clear on choices is equating a fantasy with a choice. So let's take a medical example. I'm going to take one from my own life, which is a little bit of a scary example, but it's one that happened to me several years ago. And so I like thinking about real examples. And this is with the type of infection known as MRSA. So MRSA, I don't want to go into what all the letters mean because they're hard to pronounce, but it's essentially a bacteria that causes infections that are resistant to certain kinds of antibiotics. And MRSA can be a concern for a lot of people, but particularly certain people in certain kinds of athletic activities. And an activity that I love and that is really important to my own flourishing is a martial art called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I've been doing for, what's the 15, 16 years now. And one of that involves a lot of, in effect, wrestling. And one of the hazards of that is that the wrestling mats and people's uniforms and whatnot, this bacteria can be passed on fairly easily. And I remember once I was talking to a doctor and I had a certain kind of MRSA, and it was really important for the doctor to have a constructive conversation with me about this. And I don't think he did a very good job, but I wish that he had. And one thing I would really want is I want to get clear on the choices. So I want to know all the major choices, and I want to know them without bias. So that's one thing. But another thing that can get in the way, that didn't happen in that conversation, but I see in a lot of medical conversations, is people, instead of saying, okay, here's choice A, like you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, they'll say, no, I want a natural remedy. I want a natural solution. Now, that's not a choice. That's a goal. So you might say, yeah, I would like it if I could get cured and not use any antibiotics. And maybe that is an option, but if we're looking at the real choices, the choices are use this antibiotic, do nothing, use this other thing, like let's say somebody says tea tree oil or something, that is not an antibiotic. But we have to look at it in terms of what are the actual real things that we can choose in front of us. We can't say, oh, well, we could use this antibiotic, or we could choose natural cure. You need to specify what you're talking about, and then we can look at, is this actually going to work? And to take the realm of energy again, I see this happen all the time, where I'm in a conversation and we're talking about different kinds of policies, and someone will say, I want a 100% solar society. But I'll ask, what do you want? What choice do you want to make to get there? Because that itself is not a choice. You can say a choice might lead there, but in practice, do you want to leave solar free to compete, which I would definitely be in favor of? Do you want to subsidize solar? Do you want to mandate solar? That is, do you want to force everyone to use solar on a certain time horizon? Because that is a specific choice. And then if we look at a choice, we can really look at, hey, what are the pros and cons of this choice? But if we compare a choice to a fantasy, the fantasy will always win because the fantasy has no reality to it. So it can just be perfect. Another example of this with a really controversial issue, which I won't even give my position on to the extent I have a fully developed one, but I remember when in I guess the early 2000s, when President Bush was talking about difficulties in the Middle East with Israelis and Palestinians. And he would just say, like, I'm in favor of Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in two states in peace and security. And I remember thinking, okay, that you haven't really said anything. You've just said something that sounds nice, but you haven't told me concretely what you're going to do. So let's look concretely at, we want our goal to start out with, but then we want to look at, okay, what are the concrete options? We could have this policy toward land or this policy toward a certain kind of warfare that's happening, but we really need to look at real choices. We can't compare choices to fantasies because then the fantasies will win in the discussion. And that just means that a choice but since you can't act on a fantasy directly, then you're just going to make a choice that you never considered. So when people say like, oh, I want a 100% solar society, there's some policy there, and we want to consider the policy. We don't just want to consider the fantasy because the policy might be really bad. All right, so that's clear choices and full context. Now, how do you get to full context? I mentioned this a little bit last time. I think it's actually really it's really easy. I didn't mean full context. Full context is next. That's the one I talked about last time. But with clear choices, there are a couple ways of doing it depending on how the conversation goes. One of them is, would you agree that we need to be clear on our choices? So sometimes that'll be relevant. The thing I most often use is I'll try to state the choices myself. I'll say, as I see it, we have a few basic choices. We can do X, we can do Y, we can do Z. Would you agree with that? And the reason I like doing that is because I like to attempt to lay the choices out as clearly as possible, and then I want the other person to give input on that. So I would recommend that a lot. If we're talking about a conversation, the choices are at all unclear, try to make them as clear as possible. So at this stage, if you've done what we've talked about, if you've asked, hey, would you agree on this common goal? And would you agree that these are our choices? You've now surpassed 98% of conversations the way they usually go, because it's so constructive. You can build something now because you have a goal and you have options on the table, and now you're ready for the last one, or at least the last one I'll talk about today, which is full context. And conversations often go off track because people aren't even-handed and precise about the different choices. They're usually not clear on the goal or the choices, and that doesn't happen, and that's a big problem. But even once people are talking about choices, there's usually this bias and exaggeration or sloppiness in favor of a pre-existing position. And that is, I talked about this last time, so I won't go into too much detail, and I think this is pretty obvious that this happens all the time, and this is something that we need to address early on in the conversation. And the way to do it is we just need to ask people, hey, would you agree, in effect, that we need to look carefully at the pros and cons of each choice? So once we have the goal, we have the different choices, we can say, hey, would you agree we need to look carefully at both the positive and negative impacts of each of these options? Now, you can ask that as one question. Sometimes I'll ask it as two. I'll ask, would you agree that we need to look at the pros and cons? And then would you agree that we need to look at them with a lot of precision? We need to be clear on how big they are. So if we take the MRSA example, if I'm the doctor who's having a constructive conversation, would you agree? Or at least they might not ask, would you agree? But they'll say, like, here's how I'm thinking of it. I'm looking carefully at both the pros and the cons, and then here they are. But before going into them, it's really good to frame it as, this is what we need to do. So we've got our common goal. We've got our clear choices in terms of how to achieve that goal. And then we have the full context of the different positive and negative impacts of each choice. And if we can get that to happen in a conversation, then our chances of the conversation being constructive, both from a persuasive perspective, if we know in advance a lot more than the other person, or from a learning perspective, we want to learn a lot. Either way, we're just going to be in such an amazing position if we can establish these three framing premises. And the thing that's so powerful, as I mentioned earlier, is not only are these framing premises fundamental to the success of a conversation, but they're actually very easy to improve, because most people will agree to a good framework if you ask them, but most people will not follow a good framework if you don't ask them. So do yourself a favor, do the other person a favor, and ask framing questions at the beginning. So that's the big takeaway from today. The framework of a conversation is both fundamental to its success and extremely easy to improve. This is the basis of what I call my constructive conversation system. And there's a lot more to it in terms of specific devices. And this is something that I usually teach in a 4-hour workshop. And sooner or later, I'll have some good online materials about this as well. So there's a lot of detail in terms of how do you begin the conversation, how do you enter it in an open and friendly way, how do you express your opinion even once you've framed it in the right way, how do you end the conversation. There are a lot of details, but in my experience with just this understanding of the framing as fundamental and extremely easy to improve, you can make so much progress, and you can really develop your own system. I have a system and I find it effective, and many others have found it effective, but but other people can have other systems, but I'm quite confident that a really effective system is going to involve good framing. That's the key thing to take away. And from now on, you can think of a constructive conversation or any conversation in terms of, how is this being framed? Is this being framed for success? Now, I should say, since I've started teaching this more broadly, if you have an organization where this kind of material be really valuable, for sure contact me. And I'm now teaching it far beyond the realm of energy, so we can talk about it in all kinds of different contexts, like different business contexts, different kinds of political issues, other controversial issues. Happy to talk about the potential of that. Just email me at alex@alexepstein.com and just put constructive conversation and start a conversation. We'll see if there's value to be had there. So that's going to be a possibility for some of you, but for all of you, this, I'm hoping, and I want feedback on this, is something that you can use immediately. And those of you who know that, who have listened to the show before, know that I like to end every show suggesting a particular exercise. And the one I want to suggest today, and do this when I post the show on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project. This is similar to last week's, but a little bit different. And now you have, I think, more context. If you had trouble last week, here's the exercise. Come up with and share your own framing question. So what's a question that you could ask another person that will frame the conversation better? And this can be based on one of the framing premises that I mentioned today, so common goal, clear choices, or full context. But it can also be based on something else where you think, hey, if I could frame this in the conversation, it would be really great. For example, maybe you want to frame it around, it's important for each of us to acknowledge what we know and don't know. So maybe you have a good question around that. Whether it's the premises I talked about today, or a new premise, share those, and that should help us all with our constructive conversation systems. All right, well, let's wrap up for today. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you have any kind of feedback, you can definitely post it on the Facebook page, facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project, or you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. If you too are excited about this project of creating reliable access to the knowledge we need to flourish, share it with other people. We're at an early stage in the project. That's the best thing that can happen right now as we get more and more people engaged with this set of problems and with the knowledge systems approach to solving them. So the more you can share it, the better. If you want to be kept up to date on everything and be updated about the new show, which is going to be released every Friday, usually late in the day Friday, so you have all weekend to listen to it and think about it and apply it, then go to humanflourishingproject.com and sign up for the email list. All right, next week, I'm not sure exactly what we'll be talking about, since I realize that sometimes things that happen during the week will motivate me to cover something I hadn't planned on covering, but I'm currently planning on talking about applying knowledge, which is just there's such a buffet of fascinating things to talk about and also a minefield of things to avoid. So one of these episodes or another coming soon, I'm going to be talking about that. And then going forward, we'll have all kinds of topics to talk about. So if you have any preferred topics, suggested topics, requested topics, for sure, email me at alex@alexepstein.com. All right, that is it. Hope you enjoyed Constructive Conversations. Until next time, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.